Hi everybody. So I'll just turn my specs off so I can read. So welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Annie Connolly. I work at the Food Foundation, which is a charity campaigning on food and making good food accessible to all. And I also work on a project with York Uni called Fix Our Food. So I work on and feel really passionate about issues around food and social justice, and I'll be chairing the event today. So, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panellists today. First of all, Maddy Power is an assistant professor and research fellow in health sciences at the University of York. She leads the research programme Food for Thought, which looks at the impact of food poverty on mental health. She also co-leads the Changing Realities research programme, which is working in partnership with parents and carers to document life on a low income and push for change. Since 2017, she's worked collaboratively with people with lived experience of food poverty, charities and policymakers in York to tackle food poverty. Maddy is the author of Hunger, Whiteness and Religion in Neoliberal Britain, An Inequality of Power, and A Year Like No Other, Life on a Low Income During COVID-19. And she might not say this, but I've seen that they're for sale outside. So pick one up. Are you signing, Maddy?
No.
I think you could, couldn't you? If you want Maddy to sign, buy a book. We'll make her do it afterwards. Sydnie Corley, here, is an anti-poverty activist, expert by experience and artist based in York. She has campaigned against poverty and food poverty for almost a decade. She's a former chair of the York Food Justice Alliance, which is a partnership between charities, people with lived experience of poverty, policymakers and businesses working to tackle food poverty in York. She's appeared on BBC Radio York, BBC News and in The Guardian to raise awareness of poverty and food charity. Mary Passeri is also York-based. She's a York-based anti-poverty activist, expert by experience and member of the York Poverty Truth Commission. She's been a campaigner on issues around poverty for well over a decade. She previously ran Chill in the Community CIC, which is a cafe providing food and support to members of the community. She's a former chair of the York Food Justice Alliance and has appeared on BBC Radio York and in local news media to talk about food poverty and food charity in the city of York. So a great panel today. And the way it's going to work today, we've got 1 hour, we'll finish at 3. The format of the event is you'll hear first from Maddy and then Sydnie and Mary, and then we'll open the floor and you can ask questions and hopefully we'll have a really good discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Maddy. Thank you. And if you can't hear any of us, please just shout. Okay.
That's really, really great. And thank you to you all for kind of navigating the streets of York amidst the kind of excitement and chaos of Pride, because we very much recognise the challenges of getting in. Okay, super. Can you all hear me now? Yes, fab. Right. So we are quite keen for today to be kind of, I suppose, interactive. There will be a Q&A, but like be thinking about your questions and be thinking about your ideas when we're all talking, because we really, really want to get a discussion going. And to kind of, and if that discussion is kind of contentious, that's not necessarily a bad thing. These can be contentious issues, and actually we really want to kind of deal with them and think about them. Okay, so I'm going to start off by giving a bit of an overview about the kind of wider context really around food banks in the kind of national picture, and also maybe some of the questions about what happens inside them that maybe we don't always talk about. And then Mary and Sydnie, who've got an extensive experience of running food banks, of going to food banks, are going to talk about kind of some of the myths and kind of address some of the kind of contentious questions perhaps around food charity and food giving. So, I'm going to start a little bit by just thinking about what food banks are, because over the past decade we've seen the rise of this notion of food banks. And we didn't really have it so much before 2010, and I suppose there's always things to think about why that's the date that we see as the start of the rise of food banks. Oh, really?
But anyway, let's first think about what are food banks, because increasingly we're seeing quite a complex landscape. So the basics, all right. So we have about 2,500 plus what we'd call strictly food banks in the UK. And that's a mixture of trust food banks, and they're kind of the dominant, I'd say, national food bank provider. And then we have at least 1,500, probably more, independent food banks. And that's kind of just what we know about. So
So realistically, there's going to be far more than that number, but that's what we have documented. Thinking strictly about the kind of food bank model. So the food bank model is that you go to a food bank and you get 3 days, roughly 3 days, of normally what's dry food. There might be some other bits and bobs there that you can take, but realistically you're getting a defined parcel of food, and the food will probably be dry, and there won't be a huge amount of flexibility in terms of what you might need in terms of cultural needs, dietary needs, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Often there's limits on how many times that you can go in a certain period, so it might be 3 times in 3 months, and then they say no more. The majority of food banks use, so that's Trust Trust and Independent, all Trust Trust food banks do, and the independents often model themselves on Trust Trust, use referral systems. So what we mean by referral system is it's essentially kind of like a form of means testing. So you go to somebody, a school, a GP, citizens advice, a social worker, and you tell them about your experiences, and they say, and you explain why you need food, and they say, okay, I think you probably do need to go to a food bank. Here's a voucher. I'll fill you in your voucher. And then you go to the food bank and you present your voucher, and they ask you again, why are you here? And you say again why you're here, and then you give your voucher and you get your food. It's always worth thinking about that in the kind of, the people who do get the voucher, there'll be people who don't get the voucher. And perhaps we can come back to that question about why some people do and some people don't, and perhaps the ethics around that. So yes, we're 3 days of ambient food, referral systems, a fairly kind of bureaucratic, perhaps, way of giving food. And then, but separate to food banks, I suppose, in addition to food banks, we have thousands of other food aid providers. So community cafes, pay-as-you-fill cafes, soup kitchens, which have been around for decades and decades, community allotments, lots of other ways of giving food. But food banks, the type that we probably know most about, there's lots of reporting on them, there's stats on them, and there's a particularly bureaucratic way of giving food. So, just in terms of the data, so this is just data from the Trust, who, as I said, they're kind of the main provider of food banks in the UK, and they do keep good data. So when we're understanding who's using food banks, it's often from the Trust. So these are statistics from their last year. And they show they're shocking numbers, really. I mean, I think sometimes we can get used to these numbers. They're really high, and we see really high numbers. But actually, these should be shocking. These are people in desperate need going to a food bank. And Mary said, I'm sure we'll talk about kind of, often that's not a good experience. So these should be numbers that really strike us. So almost 3 million food parcels were given in the last year. That's a 37% increase on the same period in the year before. And of the parcels that were given, 1 million of those were given to children. So if we think about these, and there might be a third more in terms of independent food aid, independent organisations, food banks. And this is particularly, the context of this is certainly the cost of living crisis, and so we've seen really dramatic rises as the cost of living crisis makes things really, really hard for people. So just to underscore that increase that we've seen since, 2008, but really 2010, this is a really steep increase in the number of food parcels that have been distributed in the last decade. And in that time, we have seen fairly dramatic policy change, quite punitive, very punitive policy change, which realistically has led to this. And we're not going to focus on that today because it's the subject for a whole other talk. But we have seen a sharp increase in the last year, and it does tie very closely to what's happened on the social policy landscape. But what I want to talk about a little bit today is, in some ways, I suppose what sometimes happens in the conversation around food banks is that the critical conversation, perhaps, is a conversation around that policy change that has led to the use of food banks. And we absolutely should be critical of that. We've got policy decisions that are creating misery for families and creating quite profound levels of destitution. And we should never, ever ignore or neglect that. But what we should perhaps also do is question how food banks are working and what it is like for somebody to go and what might happen in that space. So what I've been doing and what I talk about in the book is about perhaps these slightly more tricky issues, slightly more uncomfortable issues around what happens within food banks and the implications of that perhaps for the users. So I'm only going to talk about a couple of these issues today, because we are, in the name of time, I really want us to have a talk. But a major element about food bank provision that we don't talk about so much in the UK is religion in relation to food banks. And so the Trussell Trust, the main provider of food banks in the UK, is a Christian organisation. It has its roots as a Christian organisation, and it still has an ethics that is a Christian ethics. And often when they're recruiting for posts, at least historically, they often put on the job description that they wanted somebody who was Christian to be the manager. And the way this kind of can permeate the food bank environment is that Christianity becomes part of how food is given. So in the most basic way, food might be given from a church, and that's the building they use. But then Christianity becomes part of the provision of food. And so somebody says to someone coming into the food bank, actually, I'm here, this is a Christian organisation, would you like to pray? And so this is there's two kind of prongs to this here that I'm trying to pull out. One is that it motivates provision. So kind of maybe that's a bit more straightforward. So actually, hospitality is really fundamental to the Christian tradition. Food is really, really fundamental. And actually, that theology motivates what we see today in the form of Trussell Trust food banks giving food. And that's not necessarily a problem in itself, the fact that people have that motivation. But the reason that sometimes that needs to be addressed and needs to be questioned is when that motivation is then seeping into somebody's experience going to the food bank, who may not necessarily be Christian. They might be kind of non-religious, they might be another religion, and they go to the food bank, which is increasingly becoming our kind of often the most direct form of welfare support that we have in the UK, as we just see the kind of complete degradation of our welfare state. And they're offered that somebody can pray with them, which for some people might be fine, and actually they might feel that actually they're kind of their emotions are respected, their well-being, it's something more than just the functional nature of getting food. But for other people that could be really uncomfortable. I'm focusing here on Christianity because Christianity dominates the food bank landscape. There are some Muslim food banks. Food is profoundly important in the Sikh tradition with langar and gurdwaras, so food is really fundamental to faith. But what we see within food banks is that it becomes kind of institutionalised within the food bank landscape. And as food banks become often the kind of key form of welfare, people see, I've got 1 minute left and I've barely got through anything, I'm terrible timing. So I'm going to go on beyond religion. But okay, so whiteness before I close off. Whiteness is the kind of sister maybe to what we're thinking about in terms of religion. So whilst they're both dominated by Christianity, they're simultaneously dominated by whiteness. So what do we mean by whiteness? And I mean, it's always important, I think, when we're talking about race, is this self-critical approach that actually whiteness is part of race, and whiteness is the paradigm that often shapes how we think about what's normal and what's normal. And certainly in the context of food banks, that is happening. So whiteness is not necessarily an ethnic category, but historically embedded in power, in violence. We see it as invisible, it's often normal, it's what people are judged against. And so it comes across in kind of ideas about colourblindness, that we're saying that actually race isn't important, or universalism, so whiteness is what dominates. So in food banks, this is often the key framing kind of paradigm in terms of race. So it shapes what food is given. Food often is quite exclusive in terms of cultural needs. The staff running the food banks are largely white. They're in churches. But often when I speak to people, and I have historically spoken to people in York and in lots of other cities in the north, when I ask them about the issues of race in food banking, they deny that it's an issue, that people aren't coming because they don't need the food or the area is a white area. And what I just wanted to pull up on this map before I kind of finish is that this is a map of Bradford. And I talked to lots of people in Bradford about, there seemed to be an underrepresentation of people from the kind of local Pakistani Muslim community in the food banks. And I said, why is this? And they said, they're not here. But then if you look at the map, actually you find that the food banks are congregated in the area where the Pakistani Muslim people tend to live. So it's put it in terms of the geography of Bradford has a particular kind of geography in terms of its ethnic demography. So it's just kind of worth questioning these things and questioning these ideas and what people say to you. I probably have no more minutes, so I will go on to Sydnie and Mary, but perhaps we can come back to some of these issues when you've finished.
Thanks, Maddy.
I'll go on to... There you go, guys.
Talk amongst yourselves, really. Hello. Getting your food before looking at it. Right, guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? I'm terrible at this. I will forget I've got it and got that many times. Just let me go back and so we will get feedback. Okay, go.
Oh, feedback. You can start.
So this is Sid, the wonderful Sid, who likes to say she's all right actually. This was a Maddy Power recently, and Sid stood in front of everybody on a Zoom screen, so I imagine she stood saying, well, actually, we're all right now. This was a woman who had no heating on, 2 small children and no heating, because she was still faced with that nice little phrase, heat or eat. And people just don't think that that actually exists anymore, do they? If my daughters knew I was here now, they would have a fit in a half, because they like to pretend they're very posh and they come from a nice place, but I live in Acomb.
It's nice bit in Acomb.
There are.
Random streets.
Not the bit where I live.
No, I don't.
And it's amazing actually. I'm saying I live in Acomb and therefore you're going to imagine that there'd be some food poverty and things. The food poverty that I face is that my family, like the Adams family, my partner's had strokes, he has epilepsy, he has a special diet. My son is autistic, he should have a special diet. And I'm short, fat and hairy, and I should have a special diet. I'm diabetic. And none of us can meet the government's 5 a day. If we can have 2 fresh veg and a piece of fruit in a day, it's been a good week. And Sid is going to tell you the same thing, because she's always telling me off. I live on carbs, because if I go shopping and I get something, and it's whatever is, I don't plan the week's menu. I go to Morrison's or wherever and I see what's got the yellow sticker on it, and then I create meals around that. Sid is forever telling me off, because if there's like 2 pieces of meat or 2 pieces of fish, then obviously, like a lot of mums, I give it to my partner and to my son. So I eat the carbs, and being diabetic, I'm saying, oh yeah, I'll have more sugar, that's fine, just bring it on. So I end up following out my doctor on a regular basis. Sid tries harder.
Yeah, I'm going to be careful what I say, 'cause my daughter's around the corner and I want to respect her as well. Albeit I haven't also stood up in front of everybody for quite a long time. It's all been Zoom meetings. I do feel like I'm okay now. We say I'm probably not compared to most people. That's because I was in a worse place before. My benefits have changed to what I won't say, because I've got a daughter around the corner. But things have changed. I'm a single mum with 2 kids. Dad's around, great, he's supportive, that's great. Started off needing benefits, using the food bank quite quickly when I became like on my own, that's fine. Out of work without supporting my children. I have to go through citizens' advice, which wasn't always polite, always wasn't a great idea. You had to queue up in the back of the job centre, or was it West offices, where it's supposed to be discreet. It's not everyone knows why you're there. And not only that, you're with your young child at a time kicking and screaming because they don't want to be there either. It's not a friendly place. But then what you get isn't sufficient anyway. You're given, I don't know, some pasta and, like you say, a tin of soup and actual pasta bake. How is that a meal and how is that balanced?
Yeah, we used to give that to people just to make your soul die inside. People would come to the informal food banks that we used to run. I used to run Children in the Community, dragged Sid in with me. You like doing this, Sydney, come on. And we worked with Food Not Bombs as well, feeding people. Right in front of, what the very first restaurant there? The Ivy. And there was us with free food. But it's just the way people look here, isn't it? It's just...
Yes, that comes to you for food. Because not only that, it's fresh food, real food that you could eat, or maybe you like eating that day or a couple of days, or out of date, which it wasn't, it was fine.
Or somebody else is deciding what's good for you. There you go, that's good for you. Hot dog sausages, do you want them? It's meat. Don't eat meat. hot dog sausages don't count as meat. So you get, there is no choice. You do not get to choose what you want. My daughter, at COVID, she was one of the people initially had to absolutely shelter. And before she could get her food delivered, now her husband has a 3-figure salary, I'll just leave that there. But before she could get her food delivered to her, a special code, she had to accept a Boris box. And because there was 2 of them living in the house, in this box is the fresh vegetables. They've got half a carrot and 2 spring onions. I don't know what you're having for your dinner tonight, but I'm assuming it's more than a carrot and 2 spring onions. And that was for the week.
Well, even manky as well. They weren't even edible
No.
most of the time.
And bread that lasted a year. Did you know that one?
It's not bread, is
What
it?
is it? What?
I don't know, when we moved up here in Hartley Goats, we got bread delivered that lasted for months.
You kind of want to eat it, do you? It's like, what's it going to do to me if it lasts that long? But
Sid and I didn't really know each other, and the thing that's made us very good friends is the activism on the food level. So we joined, it was called the York Food Alliance at first, and it became York Food Justice Alliance. The fight being to get people to understand that the people who approach food banks don't necessarily have dirty leggings and an asthmatic dog. These are people I've been. And I'm going to stand here with my master's degree in developmental psychology. Sid's a university educated artist, she's got degrees and things, and we are queuing up at a food bank because there isn't work that we can work around for various reasons, which is why we do this. So the idea that a lot of people have, that the people, and I'm going to really challenge you on this one and hear what you think of the people who go to food banks. My partner, before he had strokes, and used to go out at night after all the monkey food that we sorted through. And the food that's donated to you, don't think it's good stuff. We put our hand through cabbages, literally through cabbages, looking for the good stuff. And this is food that was meant to go out to other people. We went to a shop that shouldn't be named, Sainsbury's. And they gave us, and it said literally on the front, waste, do not eat. And there was, it's like they've gone across the counter, the fresh baked stuff.
So they had them,
bread
not
buns.
nice, they had them now.
Yeah, and they put in, and there was egg custard stuck to bread, and there was half a sausage roll, and we were supposed to be giving that to families. And when we said, please can you not do that, it's just, well, what else have they got? Aren't they glad of it? And that is something that we've found a lot, isn't it? And that's what the Food Justice Alliance was out to tackle. The stereotype of the person who would be going to the food bank, the sort of food that's donated to us, and where you go. I was delivering food at night so that nobody knew in Scarcroft Road.
Yeah, the shame was definitely there, wasn't it? We had a revenue bank in town. We tried to tackle that head on more, didn't we?
Yeah.
And allowing people to choice of what they've got. And not only did they have choice, if they didn't know what to do with it, what it was, we were trying to explain and say, look, you can do this with it. And just to give them that opportunity to have their, meet their needs. Dietary would hold things back. Any other beliefs or anything, we'll try and cater for that if needs be. And it was quite nice that other food banks didn't have the, I just want to talk about meaning to, but not so much the will, but the inclination to do it. They just want to get it done and get people fed about thinking about these things, such as forth. But if someone came forward, they would try and cater for that. It's getting those people to stand up and say, look, I am struggling, this is my situation, I have the house, I have the car, my job's lost, I've lost everything. And because I've lost my job and lost everything, I've gone from being a peer, being incredibly well off, going on holidays 4 times a year, having that posh car, to now I can't even feed myself and my kids, I don't have to do this, with no support, not even signpost where to go. And not only that, they're waiting 4+ weeks of benefits, where they're also told to borrow money, which then have to owe back. So when they do get this money in, they are now behind again. And not only that, the bills are behind. So I demand about this a bit more.
Yeah.
They're trying to remember what we've been doing for the past 10 years, to be honest.
But we had, my son's autistic and he sat around there, he ran a food bank shop from Spark. So it was all very trendy, got a nice unit, and people came in and we got all this food. And initially people were coming in because it was the green thing to do, because this was all obviously food surplus that had been donated by the supermarkets. And then as things changed, and as Sid said, people lost their jobs, etc., they came because of need. And it was quite interesting to see who then had need of this food. But the reason that people came to us and stayed with us was because we gave them a choice. The food was set out like a shop. You paid £1. If you didn't put the pound in the tin, we never asked questions, because sometimes people didn't have it. But by paying, it was not charity. Nobody was giving you anything. You were doing your shopping. And that made a big difference to people's pride and dignity, didn't it? The fact that they were simply doing the shopping and choosing what they wanted.
Yeah, but found that actually people asked him to donate because they liked it so much and felt like they wanted to give.
Yeah, but we found the real eye-opener, even for me, after doing this for years, was that it was locked down, so we couldn't let people in, we couldn't let them come in twos, come to the counter, go away again. They were queuing in the street, in the snow, in the rain, to come and get food at Spark. Now, these were people that were living on Bishy Road, Scarpath Road, nice areas of York, and they'd found themselves faced with this choice of having to queue up. And we got some hot food from the bingo, didn't we? And on the day of the hot food, you should see the queue and the people that were prepared to wait. It was an eye-opener even for me, and I was used to people coming. And the need, the invisible need. There was a lady who, she got a big house, it was lovely, they couldn't sell it. They thought, we'll sell up, because we can get somewhere smaller. No, they couldn't sell, because now that one of them wasn't working, they didn't have enough money for the mortgage that they were paying. They couldn't sell the house and get a cheaper mortgage, because they didn't earn enough. So what happened was, she came to us at Spark for food, queued up for the hot stuff, and only it had heated up one room for her boys coming in from school, because it was GCSE year. And that, for people who are working, and that's the biggest thing, people don't realise it's not all benefit claimants. It's people really on the edge who are working. Working families are definitely our biggest customer base, aren't they?
Yeah.
That's the polite word, customer base.
It's really to hit on the religion bit as well, that dodgy, touchy grounds.
Go for it, I was working that one.
I'm listening, trying to think what to say. We had people come to us because we didn't offer that religious experience, which we'll take as a place for it. There is a massive place for it, and people find that supportive and humbling if that's what their beliefs are.
I don't think there's a place for it at all. But then again, I'm Glaswegian, so I've got all other views on religion when it comes.
Yeah, there is no, even the whole, there's no patronising from us. There's no, oh darling, you'll be okay, it's fine, I hope things get better for you, can we help you in any way? It was, as we're talking now, quite blunt, to the truth. Look, if we can help you, ask. If you need signposting, ask. If we don't know, we will know somebody who knows. We know everybody pretty much in York who's tackling hunger and poverty on different levels, from people on the street, from people who are trying to be hidden the secret.
Yeah, I'm really quite against the religion in food bank. Don't want something angry now, I've got my pointy finger coming. That said, the biggest agency I work for are Christians Against Poverty, Church Action Poverty, stuff. And they are brilliant, because you know what? They're a non-church church, if I can put it like that. It's decent people doing decent stuff, because if you can, you should. It's absolutely a pragmatic response, and they're really good in their research in finding out what the situation is. So while I'm busy saying no to religion in food banks, it should be no. I better come clean and say that I like working with CAP.
I think the thing that I take away is food poverty is poverty, and we need to challenge the stigma. There's lots of amazing stuff going on, and use your vote wisely. Okay, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to the panel.